The sun slid slowly across the morning sky, casting the city in golden light. Cars were honking, people were hurrying to work, and some were strolling leisurely through the streets with hot coffee in their hands. On one of the city avenues stood an old mansion decorated with snow-white flowers and festive ribbons. Today was to be the day that would be remembered for a long time, the wedding of Sophia and Adrian. Inside, everything resembled a scene from a romantic movie: shining chandeliers, expensive tablecloths, rose petals on the floor. Waiters were scurrying between tables, arranging dishes, and musicians were tuning instruments for the wedding march. Guests were beginning to fill the room, their smiles shining as brightly as the photo reporters clicking their cameras. But only one woman in this splendor did not feel joy. Sophia stood in front of the huge mirror in the bride's room. Her long white dress flowed down like a waterfall, her thin veil touching her shoulders, but she herself looked like she was about to be hit by a wave of panic. Fear lingered in her eyes, and her hands trembled as her friend adjusted the clasps on the back of her dress. "Sophia, breathe deeply," said Eva, friend and witness. "It's just excitement. Everyone has it before the wedding." Sophia gave a weak smile. "Everyone?" She exhaled with difficulty. "Does everyone feel like the world is about to fall apart before the wedding?" Eva snorted, not taking her words seriously. "Come on, you have the best fiancé anyone could wish for. Adrian is rich, handsome, and loves you madly. What else can you dream of?" Sophia turned away to the window. The guests appeared in the distance, hurrying towards the entrance. She saw their cars turning one after another toward the mansion, and her heart was pounding louder and louder with each passing moment. "That's the problem," she whispered. Eve didn't hear. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Sophia shook her head, trying to cope with her emotions. But it wasn't just pre-wedding excitement. She knew something was going wrong. The feeling had been there since the night before, when Max, her old friend, had sent her a short message: "Sophia, there's something you need to know. It's important. Come to the park an hour before the ceremony." Max had been her friend since childhood. They'd played soccer together in the backyard, climbed on old rooftops together for views of the city at night. And though life had taken them in different directions, he remained a dreamer and she became part of the world of the elite. They had always remained close. But in recent months, things had changed. Sophia had hardly seen Max, and now his sudden message had set off alarms in her. "What does he want to tell me?" she thought as Eva helped her with the final preparations. "Ready?" the witness asked, slipping her veil on and turning toward the door. "Everything is going to be just perfect." Sophia took a deep breath and nodded, but inside she was still struggling with doubts. Half an hour later, Sophia stood in the lobby of the mansion and listened to the first notes of the wedding march begin to play outside the door. The guests rose from their seats. She could feel their anticipation, every glance, every curious sigh. But at the last moment she turned her head sharply toward the window and saw him, Max. He was standing on the sidewalk opposite the entrance and looking straight at her. His gaze was intense, full of anxiety and determination. Sophia realized she had to get out. "What are you doing?" Eva grabbed her arm fearfully as Sophia took a step toward the side door. "I'm sorry," she whispered and slipped outside to the surprised looks of the clerks. Max stood motionless until she stepped closer. Her wedding dress flashed like a white blur against the bustling city. "Have you lost your mind?" she whispered, grabbing his arm. "Do you realize that I just gave up the ceremony for you?" "Yes," he answered calmly. "And I cannot keep silent. You must know the truth about your fiancé." Sophia froze. Those words seemed to cut off something inside her. "What truth?" Her voice trailed off. Max took a deep breath and said quietly, "He's been lying to you all this time. Adrian is not who he wants to appear to be." Sophia felt the ground go from under her feet. "Explain yourself, Max. Now." Max looked up, his eyes glistening with excitement. "He had another woman. Before you. And she was gone. just vanished without a trace. And the people who knew anything about it stopped talking for some reason. Sophia took a step back. Her heart was pounding so hard her ears were buzzing. "You're lying," she whispered. "Tell me you're lying." "I wish it was a lie too. But I have proof." Max pulled out his phone and showed some photos and screenshots of correspondence. "These are her emails." She begged for someone to help her, but no one would hear her. Sophia stared at the screen, feeling tears burn her eyes. "Why did you say that now?" she asked in a strangled voice. "Because I couldn't let you marry him. Sophia, he's dangerous." Those words were the final blow. She looked up to the mansion and saw people still waiting for her to return. There waiting for her is Adrian with a fake smile and full confidence in her victory. She took a deep breath. "What are you going to do?" Max asked quietly. "I'm not going back there," she answered firmly. "Never." Thus began her most desperate and important story. Sophia had given up everything to save her life and find out who she really was. The wind ruffled the hem of her wedding dress as Sophia stood on the sidewalk, unable to contain her trembling. It was as if the world around her had disappeared. No sound, no faces of passers-by, she no longer noticed. Only Max and his words echoed in her head, "He's dangerous. He lied all the time. Sophia, we have to leave." Max yanked her arm lightly, bringing her back to reality. She looked up at him in horror. "Do you realize what I just did? There are hundreds of people out there waiting for me, my family." "Adrian," she stammered, and her voice shook. "So now what?" Max squeezed her shoulders, looking straight into her eyes. "Now you save yourself. You don't care what they say about you. The main thing is to stay alive and find out the truth." Sophia closed her eyes, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of her heart. Everything was struggling inside, panic, anger, and a strange sense of freedom. "All right," she whispered at last. "Get me out of here." They quickly crossed the road and ducked into a narrow alley between the houses. Sophia felt the cold air cool her flaming cheeks. Her expensive stiletto heels clattered on the pavement, but after a few minutes she stopped and threw them off, leaving her barefoot. Max gave her a quick glance and grinned. "Now you look like a runaway heroine from a movie." "Max, this is no time for jokes." She threw her shoes into the nearest trash can and looked at him with annoyance, but still couldn't hold back a weak smile. "Where are we going?" "I have a car around the corner," he said and nodded toward the alley exit. A couple of minutes later they were already sitting in an old but reliable Renault, which Max had parked in the shade of the trees. Sophia inhaled convulsively, feeling the cold fingers of fear gradually release her chest. Max started the engine and pulled onto an empty street. The city with its gleaming shop windows and elegant buildings flashed outside the car windows like another dimension, a world to which Sophia no longer belonged. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, looking at the road in front of them. Max lifted the corners of his lips slightly. "Someplace safe. That's all you need to know right now." Sophia nodded and closed her eyes. But her mind wouldn't let go of the questions. 20 minutes later they stopped outside a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. Max quickly entered the code on the intercom, and the door opened with a quiet click. "No one will find us here," he said when they reached the third floor. Sophia went inside. The apartment was simple but cozy: a couch, a small table, a stack of books on a shelf, and an old plaid on a chair. She collapsed on the couch and covered her face with her hands. How could it have gone like this? Her voice sounded muffled, almost lifeless. Max sat down next to her and handed her a glass of water. "We'll find answers," he said softly. "But you need to pull yourself together." She lifted her head and looked at him. "Do you realize that Adrian won't just let this go? He's not the kind of man to forgive this kind of thing." Max frowned. "That's why we have to be one step ahead." He got up and pulled out his laptop, turning it on. After a few seconds, he opened a folder of documents and correspondence that pertained to Adrian. everything I've learned in the last few months is in here. Max turned around and added, and I'm willing to go to any lengths to prove the truth to you. Sophia cautiously stepped closer and saw the photos, letters, and call printouts. Each file was like a piece of a mosaic, adding up to a horrifying picture. It's impossible, she whispered, looking at one of the photos, an image of a girl with dark hair who had once been with Adrian at a formal event. Is that the same woman? Max nodded. Her name was Alice. No one else had ever seen her. Adrian claimed that she had simply traveled abroad, but there are records that say otherwise. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. Why was he doing this? She asked in a strangled voice. Max sighed and sat down next to her. I think he was trying to hide something else. Maybe she knew something about him that she wasn't supposed to know. Sophia wrapped her arms around herself and whispered. What if he does the same thing to me? Max looked at her seriously. He can't. You're not alone now. Meanwhile, in the mansion, a real scene from the drama was playing out. When it became clear that Sophia had disappeared, the guests began to talk, and Adrian, standing at the altar, clenched his fists so hard that his knuckles turned white. One of his friends approached him and cautiously said, What's going on? Adrian turned his head slowly. His gaze was icy and full of rage. She ran away, he said quietly but threateningly. The friend hesitated, but added. Maybe it's just panic. Brides sometimes do stupid things like that. Adrian smirked, but that smirk was scarier than any threat. No, it's not stupid. She recognized something. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. At that moment Max's cell phone rang. He looked at the screen and turned pale. It was Adrian's number. Sophia froze, feeling the adrenaline rush through every cell in her body. Don't answer it, she whispered. Max nodded and dropped the call. But they both knew, this was only the first step. Adrian would begin the hunt, and it would be merciless. We need to be ready, Max said quietly and looked at Sophia. Are you ready to fight for your life? Sophia clenched her fists, stifling her fear. Yes. There was silence in the room, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Sophia looked at her phone, the screen of which went out after a missed call. But even when it stopped glowing, it seemed to her that Adrian's gaze was still directed straight at her through the screen. Max stood up and started packing. His movements were sharp and confident. We can't stay here, he threw down, grabbing his backpack and checking his pockets. Sophia stood up as well, still not fully believing what was happening. Where are we going now? Her voice shook, but determination shone in her eyes. Max cast a brief glance at her. To a hideout outside the city. There are no cameras there, no communications, the perfect place. She nodded, realizing there was no other option. As they descended the stairs, Sophia heard the noise of a car pulling up. Max froze in place, listening. It's not the police, he whispered. They looked out the window on the landing and saw a black SUV parked in the driveway. 3 men in expensive suits got out of the car. One of them was talking on the phone, the other was looking for something in the trunk. Sophia turned pale. Are these his men? Max nodded. They are. He grabbed her arm and dragged her up the stairs. Quickly. We need to get to the roof. They climbed to the top floor and ran out onto the roof of the building. The wind whipped across their faces, whistling between antennas and old pipes. Max walked to the edge and looked over at the neighboring building. It was only 2 meters away from them. We'll have to jump, he said calmly, even though he realized how crazy it was. Sophia rounded her eyes. Are you kidding me? It's our only chance. Let's go. Max took a few steps back and sprinted away, easily jumping onto the neighboring roof. She froze, looking at the chasm between the houses. The roadway below was visible, with cars whizzing by. Her heart was pounding so hard it echoed in her temples. You can do it, Sophia. shouted Max from the other side. Come on. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and ran. The wind hit her face, her dress whipped up behind her, and she was flying over the abyss. For a split second she thought it would be over, but her hands touched the hard surface of the roof. Max picked her up and helped her up. I'm alive, she exhaled, trying to come to her senses. Max grinned. Yeah, and you don't even look scared. Sophia snorted, still panting from adrenaline. Is that a compliment or a taunt? But their brief exchange of phrases was interrupted by shouts from the other side of the roof. Adrian's men had seen them and were already climbing the stairs. Run! Max threw, grabbing her arm. They went down the other side of the building and found themselves in the courtyard of an old apartment complex. Max looked back and saw that their pursuers had fallen behind for now. We need to get a car, he whispered, leading Sophia to the exit of the courtyard. And where will we find it? She asked skeptically. Max pointed to a small parking lot. There. Sophia saw an old Volkswagen that looked like it had been forgotten here in the last decade. Is this a joke? She snorted. Max grinned. Unremarkable, though. He quickly checked the car door and was relieved to find it unlocked. A few seconds later the engine started with a wheeze. Get in! Max shouted. Sophia jumped into the passenger seat, and the car sped off, leaving puffs of smoke behind it. They drove out of the city 20 minutes later and turned onto an old forest road. There wasn't a soul outside, just trees and emptiness. We can take a break here, Max said, parking the car in a small clearing. Sophia got out and breathed in the fresh air. The forest was quiet, only the wind rustled the leaves. She sat down on an old stump and closed her eyes. Max sat down next to her and looked at her. You still can't believe all this is happening, can you? She shook her head. It's all like a bad dream. Yesterday I was trying on a dress and thinking about the music for the first dance, and today I'm jumping off rooftops and hiding in the woods. You made the right choice, Max said quietly. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Why were you always so sure I could get away from him? Max hesitated a little and answered. Because I always knew you were stronger than you looked. You've always been like that. Sophia looked away, feeling her heart beat faster at his words. We'll get out of this, Sophia, he added. You deserve freedom and peace of mind. She looked up at the sky, where the clouds were gathering. I hope you're right, she whispered. But somewhere deep inside she knew that the fight was far from over. Meanwhile in town, Adrian was staring at his phone screen where a missed call was flashing. His gaze was icy. One of his men stood nearby, waiting for orders. She's gone too far, Adrian hissed. You'll have to search the whole city to find her. The man nodded and left. Adrian got up and went to the window. He clenched his fist so hard that his nails dug into his palm. You're going to regret this, Sophia, he whispered. The evening came unexpectedly quickly. Dusk was slowly descending on the forest, and it was getting darker and darker. Max built a small fire to warm himself and to give Sophia some comfort after the crazy day. The fire crackled quietly and their silhouettes reflected in the trees. Sophia sat with her arms around her knees and watched the dancing flames. I never thought I'd have to hide like this, like a fugitive. She exhaled tiredly. It's even worse than I imagined. Max tossed a branch into the fire, the flames flaring brighter. Sometimes, to start a new life, you have to burn out the old one. She threw him a quick glance. You say that like you've been through something like this before. Max smirked, but a shadow of sadness flickered in his eyes. I had a similar experience, not quite like yours, but I had to run away too, when I realized I'd trusted the wrong people. And then what happened? Then, Max was silent for a second, as if weighing each word. Then I survived. It was scary at first, but I realized that fear is just a temporary state. The main thing is not to let it consume you. Sophia nodded, but her thoughts were still swirling around Adrian. What if he does find us? Her voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. Max looked up and said firmly. He won't. And if he does, we'll be ready. In the meantime, the city was abuzz with the search. Adrian's men were scouring the streets, interviewing anyone who might know something, reviewing surveillance tapes. But Max knew the city too well. He knew every alleyway, every path that wasn't captured by CCTV. Adrian stood in his office, watching a map of the city, where the points of possible appearance of Sophia and Max were marked. His assistant entered, slightly confused. We haven't found them. It's like they dissolved. Adrian turned around slowly, his face completely calm, but that made it seem even scarier. So, keep looking. Connect everyone. Pay them if you have to. The assistant nodded and walked out, and Adrian was left alone. He went to the bar, poured himself a whiskey and looked at an old photograph of him and Sophia standing together at the party. You think you can run away, but you're mine. And you've always been mine. The next day, Max and Sophia decided to change places. Max knew it was dangerous to stay in one place for long. He took a map and showed Sophia the old farmhouse where his uncle had once lived. The house had long been abandoned, but the walls were still strong, and no one would look for them there. It's far away, but it's safe, he said. Sophia nodded. Let's give it a try. The drive was long. The car rumbled deafeningly on the hills, and every turn seemed like a step toward the unknown. Do you really think we can make it? Sophia asked, and they finally saw an old wooden house hidden behind the trees. Max stopped the car and turned to her. If we're careful, yes. But you're going to have to trust me. Completely. She looked into his eyes and nodded. You're the only one I can trust. The house was unexpectedly cozy. Max quickly prepared everything for the night. He cleaned the old fireplace, found a couple of plaids that had miraculously survived. Sophia sat on the old sofa and looked at the wooden walls, smelling of time and dust. I sometimes think, what if I hadn't found out the truth? She said, looking thoughtfully at the crackling fire. Maybe I would have just lived a life of illusion. Max sat down across from her, his face lit up by the soft light of the fire. Sometimes an illusion isn't the worst thing. But it would have crumbled sooner or later anyway. You made the right choice. Sophia smiled, though it was a sad smile. I'm so tired. Rest, Max said quietly. No one will disturb us here. She lay down, curled up under the blanket, and for the first time in days allowed herself to just close her eyes and let everything go. But the calm didn't last long. In the dead of night, Max was awakened by a strange sound outside. He got up slowly, walked to the window and peered out cautiously. His heart clenched. A black car with its headlights off appeared on the road. Shit, he whispered and quickly returned to Sophia. Sophia, wake up, he said quietly, shaking her by the shoulder. It's time for us to leave. She opened her eyes, still not realizing what was happening. What happened? They found us. Her eyes rounded, but panic quickly gave way to determination. She stood up and threw her jacket on, ready to follow Max. Adrian's men were already approaching the house. One of them signaled, and the others drew their weapons. But Max was one step ahead. He knew the back door that led straight into the woods. Come, he whispered, pointing to a wooden door in the floor. They climbed out and ran through the dense forest. Branches whipped at their faces and the ground was slipping away from under their feet, but they didn't stop. Behind them they heard voices and footsteps. They were being chased. Max looked back and saw the light of lanterns between the trees. He grabbed Sophia's hand and quickened his pace. We're almost at the creek, he said. They won't find us there. Sophia felt every cell in her body screaming with exhaustion, but she couldn't give up. Her life now depended on every next step. When they reached the creek, Max turned around and said, We'll dive in. The current is swift, but it will carry us far enough. Sophia sighed, but nodded. Come on. They jumped into the water, and the cold immediately burned their skin. The current swept them up, and in a second the forest was behind them. Sophia tried to stay on the surface, but the current was too strong. Max swam beside her and helped her. After a few minutes, they were swept onto a rocky shore. Sophia struggled to get ashore and fell to her knees, panting. Max sat down beside her, also breathing heavily. Did we got out? She asked, catching her breath. Max nodded and looked up at her with a smile. Yes. But it's not over yet. Adrian stood by the forest, looking at the empty clearing. His men had returned with nothing, and he felt that familiar rage again. Find them, whatever it takes, he gritted his teeth. But somewhere in the back of his mind he already knew that Sophia was stronger than he thought. The night was cold and damp. Sophia was sitting by the tiny fire that Max had built on the bank. They'd gotten out of the river, but her shivering wouldn't subside, not just from the cold, but from the realization of what was happening. Water dripped down her hair, her dress clung to her body, and her heart was still pounding like it was ready to jump out every second. Max came over with a bottle of water he'd found in his backpack. Drink, he said softly, taking a seat beside her. Sophia took a couple of sips and wrapped her arms around her knees. I can't live in fear anymore, Max. How much longer are we going to run? Her voice was quiet, but there was a firm determination in it. He sighed and put his hand on her shoulder. You're right. We need to act first. She looked up at him. What do you mean? If we reveal the truth about Adrian ourselves, he won't be able to come after you anymore. I know someone who can help make all this public. Sophia froze, realizing that this plan was dangerous. But they had no other choice. All right, she said after a short pause. Let's do it. The next morning Max brought her to an old workshop belonging to his acquaintance Merrick, a journalist known for his exposés. Merrick met them at the door, looking around. He was a short man with sharp features and a wary look. Come in quickly, he whispered, closing the door with several locks. Inside, the room was littered with computers and file folders. Merrick sat down at his desk and folded his fingers in front of him. Max said you have something explosive. I'm listening. Max pulled out a thumb drive containing correspondence and documents that compromised Adrian and handed it to Merrick. Sophia clenched her hands nervously as she watched the journalist open the files and look through them. Shit, Merrick exhaled, frowning. This isn't just a dirty case. This is a scandal on a huge scale. There are not only financial frauds here, but also traces of disappearances. Sophia turned pale. So I wasn't wrong. Merrick closed the folder and looked up. We have to publish everything. But you need to be ready, he will do anything to stop you. Max nodded. We're ready. The news broke like wildfire. Within hours of publication, the headlines were all abuzz with the revelations: businessman of the year or criminal, the shocking truth about the admonished man from the scandalous wedding. It had become a sensation on social media, and all anyone was discussing was Sophia and her elopement. Adrian sat in his office and stared at the screen with a stony expression on his face. He saw the articles, the comments, and the thousands of reposts. His world was crumbling before his eyes. He squeezed the phone so hard that the plastic crackled. His assistant walked in, confused and pale. Mr. Adrian, the journalists are at the entrance. They are demanding comment. Adrian stood up, his eyes blazing with anger. Get out, all of you, he growled. The assistant ran out, and Adrian, unable to contain his rage, hit the table so that his whiskey glass fell and shattered. Sophia, he hissed, and there was a threat in his voice. Meanwhile, Sophia and Max were hiding in Marek's apartment, waiting to see what would happen next. Sophia sat by the window and watched as the city outside the window lived its normal life as if nothing had happened. What do you think will happen now? She asked Max quietly. He sat down next to her and shrugged. It's the end for him. Now his name will only be associated with deception and disappearances. And for me? Her voice trembled. Max looked at her carefully. For you, this is the beginning. You are free, Sophia. She sighed and smiled, sincere for the first time in a long time. You know, I used to think freedom was just a nice word. But now I realize it's more than that. It's the right to choose your own life. He smiled too and said softly. And now you can choose whatever you want. Sophia looked at him, feeling her heart beating calmly and confidently. What about you? What will you choose? Max blushed slightly and, lowering his eyes, whispered. I've already made my choice. She squeezed his hand and they sat in silence, savoring the moment that belonged only to them. The next day, Adrian was detained right in his office. He tried to keep his cool, but the camera flashes and the shouts of the reporters showed, from now on he was the fallen king. Sophia watched the report on TV and realized that her life finally belonged to her. A few months passed. Sophia moved to another city, got a job and started drawing again, as she had once done in her childhood. Her hands no longer trembled with fear. Max came to visit her sometimes, and every time they talked, it was a reminder that even the scariest stories can end with the beginning of something new. And while there were still many questions in her life, she knew one thing: she had gotten out of the darkness and could now live the life she wanted to live. Thank you for walking this journey with the characters in this story. I hope this story about the power of family, forgiveness, and new beginnings has inspired you and reminded you of the importance of support and love even in the most difficult times. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your impressions and comments. Your thoughts and feedback are very important and inspire new stories. Subscribe and give us a like so we don't miss new stories. I apologize for any errors in the text. Thank you for your understanding and support.